Hello and welcome back. This is the next video in my series on edge cases, where I take these sort of boundary conditions or transition zones where a position can switch from a win to a draw or a win to a loss and vice versa. And the position we're looking at today is this one I've got there on the thumbnail, the Centurini bishop's position, Centurini position, whatever you want to call it. And that's what we learn. Both those diagonals in front of the pawn must be at least of length 4 for the defending side to be able to draw the game. So by the end of this study, hopefully we'll be able to understand exactly why is that the case. Why doesn't it work if it's a length of only 3 versus a length of 4 or 5? And by seeing the winning strategy which white uses in those positions of particularly, let's say, a length of 3, but also the drawing resources of the black position when the diagonals of length 4, we'll get a better understanding of the position. Okay, so now, the first thing I'm going to do today is actually have a little bit of a look at Centurini, because I'm using this as an opportunity, just a bit of a tour, see what these guys and the history of chess and so on, because I find that really fascinating. So let's just move across to my capture screen, where I've got a couple of articles here we can have a quick look at. Now, this Time Note website seemed to be the best one for a little bit of information on Centurini. What you can see is that he's sort of got a very similar profile to some of the other characters we've seen, like Lowcock and so on. So let's have a look. He was born 200 years ago. Well, that's fairly accurate. And he graduated in law. So obviously he's well educated and continued his studies in politics and economics. Now, we notice he born in Genoa, which Bianchetti, about 50 years later, he was born in Genoa as well. So you can see obviously there's a lot of chess culture in the north of Italy. Kind of mirrors what was perhaps going on in England at the same time. And in fact, historically, this area, Modena, I mean, it's sort of middle north of Italy, for lack of a better description, also had the Modenese masters, right? So there's obviously a lot of tradition in the area, which the guys are building on. Anyway, Centurini, he actually the Commissioner for Public Education for many years. Hopefully he brought chess into the schoolroom, who knows, numerous commissions. As a chess player, profound analyst, so more of a studier than a player. And you have a look. So there's a few books he's written. 1853, Endgame, Rook and Knight versus Rook. And he wrote a book about gambits. And I think this study we're looking at is from 1856. And then also you can see that he wrote articles in La Regence and Le Chess Monthly. And on top of that, corresponded with the greatest experts of his time. Now, Jaenisch, we know from Jaenisch Gambit. Goretzky-Kornitz, had to look him up. He actually played games against people such as Max Lange in that era. So you can see he's part of the environment which is around at that time. And then another good website here is Aves, which has a lot of information on particularly the end games. Actually has a picture of Centurini. Here's the frontispiece of the book we just mentioned. And then you can see he just doesn't do his bishop endgame position. He does all these other endgames as well, rook and knight and his queens and bishops, so on, right? So obviously a very skillful endgame analyst. Okay, so let's just close that and have a look at this Centurini position, understand it a little bit better, image I was showing you on the thumbnail. Okay, so this is the structure you normally look at. You have got an advanced pawn, and we're looking at the square in front of it, and that's sort of the key square are the two diagonals longer than 3 in length. Now, there's a couple of points here you need to think about in terms of this position, right? The black king controls both the pawn and the square between the two kings. And what that means is the white king can't really go very far because he has to hold on to the pawn. And I think more importantly, it stops the white bishop from blocking the black bishop in this case on that square, which would be pretty damn nasty. If you could block it there, then black wouldn't be able to do much. So that's sort of the general layout, and we'll see in a bit more detail. But the point is that what normally happens is that therefore the attacking side, or white in this case, has to use the square in front of the pawn to drive the other bishop away, and then the bishop would then have to move around onto the other diagonal. So because of the location of all the pieces, white can push the black bishop off one defending diagonal, but only in such a way that gives the defending side a chance to switch over to the other diagonal, which is now why you start to understand why both diagonals are important in the calculation. And then I'm doing this because I kind of just found a use for my corresponding square markups. So if you imagine a diagonal which is 4 squares long, you can have what tends to happen is the white king might be able to cover 2 squares, white bishop cover the third one, and there's a spare one which the black bishop can be on. Now, if you look at the diagonal with length of 3, king will cover 2, and then the white bishop can actually cover the other one, often by putting itself, for instance, on this diagonal, and the bishop gets driven away. That just gives you a simple understanding of what happens in some, but not all cases, in terms of the Centurini position. Anyway, so that's going to be the key in terms of when we look at the actual lines, which the different attacking and defensive techniques will often rely on that length of the shortest diagonal. And now what I want to do is have a quick look at what Carsten Muller has to say in his book, Fundamental Chess Endings. And let's just quickly have a look at this little graphic I've put together showing how a lot of these composers kind of fit together. Now, the interesting thing about this is we've got Centurini here, and because he's from Genoa, and so is Bianchetti, also from Genoa, and obviously there's this strong tradition, you think of the Modenese masters and so on, of strong chess players in the area of northern Italy and Lombardy and so on. So that's quite interesting, and we might see more composers who pop into that category as well. Got these other guys all around the turn of the 19th century, Grigoriev, Reti, Bach, Cheron, so on. We've seen them before, Logog a bit earlier. This guy I haven't got to. Obviously, Dutch has some tradition in chess as well, so there's Van Zuylen, another guy. So I'm going to sort of build this up and just sort of understand a bit more about all the, just from a historical perspective, the links between the different chess players and chess composers. You can see it's a bit clunky, my picture, world's worst picture, but let's just have a look at what Muller and Lamprecht have to say about it. First thing is you look at those two rules at the top, which you can barely read. I'll read them out of you. Rule 1. If the defending king reaches a square in front of the pawn opposite to the bishop's colour, it is an ironclad draw. Now, I've seen that word used a bit in this case. Well, I mean, ironclad is a bit overdoing it, but basically, you know, if you're sitting in front of the pawn and your king can't be evicted any way possible, then that's a draw. And the other one is then you've got to look at Centurini's rule, which is what we're talking about. And let's have a look. If we go across to second column, Centurini's rule. If the passed pawn has advanced beyond the line, the attacker is winning as one of the diagonals is shorter than 4 squares and therefore not long enough to avoid a zugzwang position. Kind of what we've been saying. So that 1856 diagram there at the top right column is a draw because both diagonals are long enough in that position. And he shows again even took Gelfand, which was also drawn. So that's the gist of it. And basically what we're going to do now is look at my simulator, and then that will kick out all the winning lines and defensive lines for 4 and 3 length diagonals, which kind of what we're looking at, and we'll understand the position a lot better. Okay, here we are back on the capture screen. Now, if you remember how this version of the simulator works, just to make sure you can see that screen. Basically what it does is it takes that little block there of pieces, like a subfen, and you can see that that's kind of the sort of the classic, you know, king, bishop, pawn versus king and bishop, and it pastes that onto all the squares of the board and then evaluates that position using a table base. So the idea being that, you know, it's either a win, a loss, or a draw, depending upon whose side move it is, or both sides, right? And when I do the calculation, I do this one first, and you can see I've done that setup. I mean, the main idea is that white shouldn't be able to advance the pawn on the first move. So that setup of kings and bishops does that. And you can see that gives you kind of the answer you want. You can see that green means that black can draw under all scenarios, and red means that it is a win for white, regardless of who it is to move. And you can see this is actually showing those sort of corners up at the top. Let's have a look at this corner here, divided by that diagonal. So that's the square which the pawn is on. I'm really clear about that. Sorry, that's the square the pawn is on. So if the pawn's on that square, or further up, then the diagonal's too short. And the same on the other side. If the pawn is on a diagonal which is 4 long, then obviously the diagonal in front of it is going to only have a length of 3. A couple of weird things. Look at this one, by the way. This square here, some of the squares towards the back rank, if the black king will be back here, white will be able to push 2 squares, and that actually gets the pawn far enough advanced eventually to be able to win. And the other thing is this exception square. If you read closely, that Carsten Muller highlights 2 squares, particularly this one, which actually is still a draw, even though the diagonal in front of the pawn would only be 3 long. So that was one setup I did, which was okay. And then what I did is I close that screen, get rid of that. Let me run another. I did another setup, same setup, different block. Just move it so you can see it. Yeah, different block of pieces, same pieces, but I just compressed it into a smaller square, which I think actually works quite a bit better. And the point here is that, once again, white cannot advance the pawn straight away because I put his bishop in front of it. And if I do the calculation here again, it comes up with the same scenario, right? If the white pawn is on this diagonal length 4 or that diagonal length 4, then you've got a shorter diagonal in front of you, and therefore it is win. Once again, this f7 square shows up as being an exception to the rule, and once again we've got some grey squares. The grey squares turn up for a couple of situations. One is the first move, and the other one is that if the way I've set it up here, I mean, there's obviously some variation with the bishop position. The black bishop cannot actually reach the diagonal. Let's say the e8 to h5 diagonal. The bishop sitting here, it can't actually get onto that diagonal in one move. So that's the problem, right? Obviously, so if the bishop was on other squares, then obviously you could quickly flick around and block the pawn from the other way, but it can't do it in this case. Let me just fire that up again. So got the scenarios, and then now what I do is I press the calculate button, and what it will do is the next step. We're going to go onto the analysis board. It will, for any transition square, so b6 square has got greens and reds next to it, so we'll analyze that one. b5 square has greens and reds to it, so it actually puts together about 20 squares. You can see the list of them here. Let me just drag that up there. That's actually quite a lot of squares. It will do the winning line or the drawing line for those squares, and we can look at it in Scid versus PC. So let's say the normal process here is I just press C for calculate. There, actually, and you can see what I've done here is I've just calculated about a move depth of 20 using a stockfish rather than table base in this case, and I'll just come up with the lines, creates a PGN, and then we'll go through that PGN now. Let me just load that up. Okay, here we are with Scid loaded up. Now, the first thing I'm going to have a look at is those grey squares, which I highlighted earlier. If you have a look at this game list in Scid versus PC, you can see for the squares, F1, G1, G2, G3, I gave a grey colour. We'll just quickly go over them just to show why is that the case. Why were those squares losing, even though technically they were kind of in the drawing zone? Okay, so here we have the black king on F1. So let's have a look at what happens here. Actually, that was the starting position, bishop F4. Obviously, black's got to do something, so let's imagine that he tries to bring his bishop back to this diagonal. Then white is just pushing his pawn, and you can see that the black bishop can't actually block it on that diagonal, and the king is not going to be able to help. So let's say the king tries to get around, then d5, just push the pawn, and it's gone, right? So some of those grey positions are exactly like that. Okay, so and then we can try another one just for humor. Okay, same position here. Now let's have a look what we're doing. This bishop, the black bishop, obviously needs to get onto this diagonal somehow, right? Doesn't look like it can do it, or to get on this diagonal somehow. So it's white to move, so white goes there. Let's just d1, and then what's black going to do? I mean, black might try and circle around to get onto that diagonal. Just push. What you can do? It's just these positions are losing, right? So you can see that there are some very bad positions for the black king and the black bishop in those cases. Okay, so let's go on to the main file, which that was the grey ones, and then we'll just open up the rest of the positions, which is this file here. It's given us 15 lines, and let's go through a few of these lines. This is where we want to understand, what's going on in each of those positions, which makes the position a win or a draw. So let's just go through them one by one. First one is the black king is on f3, so the white pawn is on g4. And if you have a look at that, let's do the two diagonals, that diagonal and that diagonal, and both of them are longer than 4. So this should be a draw, apart from the fact that maybe the bishops are in a bad position, but this is a draw, and let's see how that's done. Right, so we understand what's black's drawing technique in positions exactly like this, where you have two nice long diagonals. Okay, and remember, king moves, probably grab the pawn, and white can't block you on that diagonal. So basically what happens is the white bishop's going to move somewhere, and we just hop on to the other diagonal. So let's just have a look at the line it's generated and see if it makes any kind of sense. Okay, bishop to c1, let's do this other base move, and then so we've got to actually hop straight onto that diagonal, but fair enough. And then now white might prepare to force you off that diagonal. Well, of course, you can go straight back there, and then in which case you just move your bishop away. So let's try that again. On the diagonal, maybe white tries a different way to drive black off that diagonal. Well, now the bishop has this diagonal to move around. Let's say bishop d8. Let's say we block. Makes sense. Block it there. Then, well, actually, see, this gets back to the fact the king is guarding the pawn. You can't block You never block on those squares because the exchange of bishops, you just grab the pawn. So you can't block there. Well, let's move around and try and block. I mean, black just stays on that diagonal, and if we try and drive it off the diagonal, then we are back to the starting position. This thing I mentioned before, because white, often that's the only square it can drive the bishop off the diagonal, then that gives black the extra move to be able to shift to the other diagonal. Okay, so that is with the black king on f3. Let's move on to the next game. Okay, so this is one of the winning positions. Now, why is it a winning position with the diagonal lengths 3? The f8 to h6 diagonal is only of length 3. So let's look at the winning line. Several winning lines, but this is the line, the bishop to d2. So we've got to maneuver around to drive the bishop off the diagonals. Of course, in the starting position here, black can't actually get to that shorter diagonal, so moves around, pawn gets pushed. We can block on the long diagonal there, let's do that, but that's never going to hold because we just block on that diagonal. That's a simple version. We'll see many versions of this, but that's a simple version of the shorter diagonal, and white is able to easily advance his pawn. Okay, so let's move on to the next case we have here. Okay, so this is going to be a draw. We'll just go over this one quickly, but once again, you look at the diagonals, they're both more than 4 in length, and the same thing, the computer line here, it's moved the bishop away, and then basically we just hop onto the diagonal and stop white from advancing his pawn. If we go back and block, or we can almost go anywhere. Let's try another square, go back there. This is a computer generated line, and you can see basically just white messing around. No way to make progress, just hold that position, right? Pawn can't advance because we're taken, bishop stays in that diagonal, and king keeps pressuring the pawn. Okay, try a few more. Okay, here is a winning one. Let's have a look why it's winning. Let's have a look at the diagonals. One is only length of 3. Let's have a look at the computer generated line. So bishop e4. Now the most resilient is we go to the a6 square. Okay, so now this is where we're going to be a little bit tricky. Many moves win, but let's have a look at the way white gets that bishop kicked off that diagonal. Right, now remember, black cannot move his king. It's like a zugzwang position here because there'll be a check. So white just moves to f5. What's black going to do? Move the king, lose to a check. That diagonal, and how many squares are on this diagonal? Remember I highlighted earlier that the king can cover 2 squares. And then now we've got our bishop covering the 3rd square, so that black doesn't have a move, has to surrender the key diagonal, and the pawn will be pushed. Once again, all the activities on the short diagonal. The long diagonal doesn't matter, right? So that's a very good example. That it's just this very subtle move there, just sort of blocking the bishop's alternatives. Okay, let's go another one. Okay, this is quite easily a draw. You can see the lengths of the diagonals there. Plenty of space for black to maneuver. Making good progress here. So this will be lost again. Let's have a look at why this is lost. Now, although this position kind of might look the same as we go through them, it obviously depends whether the king's on the center side of the pawn or to the wing side, and you get slightly different winning strategies here. Let's see what the computer thought here. Just get off the diagonal. Black has to hop onto that diagonal. The white king is kind of zugzwanged as well, so we just play bishop a3. Let's have a look at what the choices are. The bishop can't move, so the king has to move. King cannot move to that square. That would be disaster because of the check. King has to sort of give up holding the pawn. King moves d4, could be anywhere. Now we drive the bishop off the short diagonal. Bishop's got to go back. Bishop, it wants to drop onto that long diagonal. Bishop drops back, and that's it. Game's over. Problem, once again, it's a zugzwang problem here, is that bishop to f8 works, but only with king removed from attacking the white pawn. And that's what we're able to do because of black's lack of maneuvering space and getting put into a zugzwang position. So that's another important one to remember. Okay, let's keep going. What's the next one? This one will be a draw because the 2 diagonals are long enough. This one will be a loss. Because the short diagonal is actually very damn short. So, in fact, black can't even get onto the key diagonal. So white just moves his bishop and pushes the pawn, and that will be a win, so we don't need to go too detailed into that one. This one will be a draw because of the two diagonal lengths. Keep moving on, making nice progress here. This will be a win, but it's to go over quickly. Got to move the bishop out of the way, move the bishop out of the way. Black bishop has to block, and we just do the same waiting move. Got to just remember that waiting move. In fact, this gives the full line, right? Because bishop moves with queen, so maybe that looks the most resilient. Check, take the bishop, and we will be winning. Okay, so this will be an easy draw. Okay, this one is a win. Let's have a look at how this one works. Bishop moves out. Black has to block the diagonal. And you have a look at the situation. Let's highlight that once again. The white king is covering these two squares, so we just have to cover that square. Let's see what white does. Right, and now it's going to be a win because if black moves his king to c6, we've seen this before, check, and we get grab the bishop. Okay, so that's hopefully getting a bit more familiar with these. That will be a draw. That will be a win. Let's have a look at how this plays out. Bishop back there, black has to block, and then now we just decoy. Constant theme here is either you're blocking a square and putting black in zugzwang, or we're using the bishop as a decoy. So don't do anything of that. Black will lose. Okay, now this position is a draw. Now technically, you look at the diagonal lengths, it should not be a draw, but it's kind of unique because in this case, I think it's more like white is the guy without moving space. So let's have a look at what the line is. So white tries to get out of in front of the square. Black has to block, but now we're on a better diagonal, so we're going to be able to hold because that diagonal is long enough. So what we should do is we should retreat along this diagonal. Okay, let's retreat along this diagonal. Let's just replace move and see what black does now. Okay, black does bishop to g7. And the point is what's happened here is that the white king is only covering one square on the diagonal. And we've got two squares over here, which can't both be covered by the bishop. So we can try a nice little decoy, but of course the thing is that you don't take, you just move up to there. So that's the exception. That's that position which Carsten Muller pointed out. Obviously, if the king was on the other side, that square there, then it would be covering both f8 and g7, and it would be a win. Okay, that was an interesting one to understand. Let's keep on going. So that's actually the last of the defined positions. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through one very famously difficult version of winning. I mean, it all depends a little bit on the bishop positions and the king position, so we'll look at that first. And then after that, we'll go and look at a few important real-world examples of the Centurini position and seeing how people dealt with it. So what we'll quickly do, let me load up my endgame database, and we will... Okay, this is the one. It's really interesting. There's quite a clever maneuvering to try and win this game. First thing to point out is you've obviously got to get the bishop off this diagonal. How do we get the bishop off that diagonal? With the king constantly covering the c7 square, you can't do it. So we're going to have to get the bishop off that diagonal by getting to the b8 square. And obviously we're going to do that by getting onto this diagonal and reaching it via the a7 square. I mean, I get there, but we've got to threaten to do that. And if we threaten to do that, what actually happens is the king gets pushed over to there. And then that opens up the possibilities back on directly driving it off the h2 to b8 diagonal. Let's see that in practice. I mean, I'm just following, once again, following the computer line, which it had given me. Bishop g5. There's a threat there. The threat is there, there, and there. And that will be winning. So black has to deal with that, and if black does not move to there on the next move, he won't be able to deal with it, right? So therefore, or to there. Both those moves amount to the same thing. So let's see what is being given. King b6, we check. So now the king must go to a6 to stop us from approaching the a7 square. Okay, good. Step one's done. Now we've got to do this next maneuver of the bishop, where we try and get around to d8 as quickly as possible so that we can... This is kind of the process we're talking about. It takes a few moves, but let's see how that goes, right? So first step, bishop to there. Now, the king cannot give up coverage of that square, so that king is locked. So basically, black is restricted to a bishop move. Now we go bishop to e7. We're threatening to go there and there, so the black king has to move to block that, right? Which is what the black king does. Now you think, well, what's the difference there? Now the difference is the black bishop is now in a more exposed square. So let's see what we can do. Check the king. King moves. Right, got to move that way. Got to cover this square. And then now the decoy. Decoy number 1. Bishop h4. Saves the tempo. This is the whole thing, right? Bishop can't give up that diagonal. So we force the black bishop into a bad square. Now it goes back there. And then now we can implement our plan. Bishop f2. Nothing to be done now. Let's say the king tries to go over and cover. You might think, okay, there's still one more step. But we can also block there. Great. We can also block there. We can also be decoyed away from there again, right? So you can see that very interesting way of doing it. If you go back to the very initial position, we couldn't attack the black bishop from the side, but we forced the black bishop to go there, and then we were able to get that extra tempo by moving our white bishop to that square. Okay, so that's great. That is considered the most difficult maneuver in the Centurini position, but you can see that in most of these cases, there's always a way of doing it by zugzwang and decoys by the stronger side. Okay, so now what I want to do is load up a list of interesting real-world games. Now, I'm sorry this is dragging on a bit, but what we're going to do is going to look at 5 of these games, not 6 of them, right? Just get a bit of an idea of what goes on in the Centurini position in the real world. Okay, so I've looked at older games. They tend to be quite interesting. So this is Cheruzik. This is Showalter. This is the position. So that's one example. Let's quickly go on to, this is a fascinating example, this one. Once again, it's the same sort of situation. It was a transition from a Centurini style position, but with an extra pawn. Extra pawn's gone now. Right, so this is where the game was resigned by black, but it's actually a drawn position. There's some analysis on this by Averbach later on, right? Really fascinating. And it gets back to think that what are the 2 ways that black can draw? You plonk your king on a square like that in front of the pawn, or you get behind it and pressure it before the white pawn has advanced too far. And that's actually the drawing line is actually that you circle around the back, right around the back. As white advances to try and push his pawn forwards. I mean, there are obviously different lines here, but you know what we got? We got the Centurini position, right? Go back 1 second. You might think, well, why doesn't white play bishop to there? Well, let's give that a shot. H4. Now we're controlling this diagonal. We might go there, for instance. Back on this diagonal. We're blocking it that way. And if we drive it off, obviously our king is going to get there, and we're going to be back in the positions we've been thinking about, right? So Janowski resigned in a drawn position. Obviously, it's a very difficult position. If you look at that saving maneuver, just look at this. This is quite a famous one. Taimanov. Let me go to the position we're looking for. Okay, this will do as good as any. White's pawn is quite far back, so there's some chances here. And then, but you can see pretty clearly the black king can't get all the way in front of the pawn there. So the defensive strategy is going to be similar to what we just saw. A bit of maneuvering around, bring your king up, blocked. Now the thing is, the white king has to advance quite a bit to be able to drive the bishop off this diagonal, and while the white king is doing that, you actually have the opportunity to get behind and basically bishop game into a Centurini position. Obviously the bishop can't be taken because the pawn gets taken, and then it's a Centurini. Very fascinating, this one. There's some comment about Taimanov asked Fischer about this after the game. How could you solve it and play so quickly? And Fischer said he'd obviously been reading the Russian endgame material. So that was a very interesting one. Just wanted to demonstrate this is one of these drawing techniques. This is drawn. I mean, it doesn't look like it because this diagonal is too short, but the point is, because black is constantly got the threat of getting across to this square, black can't organize himself to get to a more advanced position with his king. So the game, just to show you how the game continued here a little bit, I mean, black obviously wants to try and get around via the H file, but you know, not able to. There's no squares to penetrate. That's quite interesting. And then the final one I just have a quick look at here is another Taimanov game. How often does that happen where the same guy keeps on ending up with go back to the position? You can see this is sort of its transition from a earlier endgame, and we've got a Centurini position. Just a reminder, diagonal's long enough, black king's pressuring the pawn, move around, and I think we're going to end up with exactly the position we've been looking at. There we go, Centurini. So that's quite interesting. I mean, Taimanov had it twice. People, you play enough endgames, you end up meeting the same position enough. Obviously, you've got to play bishop g6 to block and so on. Okay, so I think that wraps it up. Covered quite a lot today. We've covered Centurini himself, and then we looked at the sort of using the simulator to go through all the theoretical lines to understand the winning technique for white when the diagonal is too short, and the drawing technique for black when the diagonal is long enough. And then it's been quite interesting just to look at a few of these famous games to see how they actually handled the Centurini position in real life. Hope you enjoyed that one. Thank you very much for watching.